there are foresters out there, for instance, right now without a particularly changed mandate, trying to fight fires in a landscape massively contaminated by unexploded ordnance.
Yeah, which is a whole other thing. Yeah,
it's just and like so we need to ramp up and accelerate the discussion, and by looking for resources. Ukraine has just a million things on its plate. It's said that demining alone might cost $37 billion and take decades. So, like, there's so much on Ukraine's plate. There need to be resources and support for a Ukraine-driven process, about these forest landscapes that are now infinitely more tricky. And it was already an amazingly it was a fascinating management sort of knot to be thinking about just after the last invasion, which was, a fraction as destructive as this one.
Hey folks, what's happening? Welcome to Your Forest. My name is Matthew Christoph, and on this podcast, we talk about the environment and the science of sustainability. Today, though, we're talking about war. We're talking about war and forests. War is a disturbance. We're talking about the incredible challenges and just piling on of challenges and difficulties and crises in Ukraine. We're talking about Ukrainian resilience, Ukrainian efforts to manage their landscape during this war, during this invasion, the challenges that go into it. How do you fight fire? How do you create economic resilience and economic prosperity during a time like this, right? When you're just trying to hold on, you're just trying to survive. And I brought on Brian Milakovsky. I was lucky enough to hear him speak on the Yale Forest Forum a little while back, all about Russia's war on Ukraine and Ukrainian forests. You can check that talk out if you go to that website, the Yale Forest Forum. And it was a great conversation, a great presentation, I should say, him and a colleague of his, Sergei Zipsev. And I wanted to have him on the podcast to tell his story and spread it more. So he talks about, what does the landscape in Ukraine look like? And what is the land use history? Like, what are the normal disturbances on that landscape? What do people have to deal with? What is the ecology like? And then add war to that. Now what? With war, how do you do this? How do you manage this? Like, forest management's hard enough. There's enough things to think about. And now you got to add a war? An invading army? Like, what are you supposed to do? I have no idea. And Brian was great though. He really has practical solutions, practical ideas. And it was just great to get his opinion and get his story out there so we can understand better. And finally, in the end, he gives us a little more of how we can help. How you can help the people of Ukraine, how you can help the Ukrainian forests, Ukrainian foresters, all those types of things. There's going to be a bunch of stuff in the show notes if you want to help out. That's going to be there. Please do. Ukraine needs all the help they can get. I think we can all agree with that. So, sponsors for this episode, Wes Fraser is the number one, and without Wes Fraser, this would not be possible. Thank you, Wes Fraser, for allowing me to do it the way I want to do it. And Greenlink Forestry is the only other sponsor. Without them, this would not be possible either. Been with me since the beginning. And I can't thank them enough. So thank you, Greenlink. Thank you, Wes Fraser. And without any further messing around, let's just dive into this conversation about Ukraine's forests during this Russian invasion. Here we go. I think to get started, I want to first get you to tell me about yourself a little bit, about your involvement in Ukrainian forests and why it's such an important topic for you.
Sure. Yes. Thanks so much for having me on. I love talking about this particular issue. So I'm from Maine, actually, from the U.S. I'm a forester by training, although I've probably worked more, I'd say, as a forest ecologist, although really love silviculture and the practice. I got really into Eastern Europe from, say, university years onwards. I have a lot of roots in this part of the world. not in Ukraine actually, but nearby, Belarus, Lithuania.
Okay.
And that really always sort of put a hook in for me to this part of the world. I started studying Russian and sort of gradually decided to combine, silviculture, forest ecology, and Russian language over there.
Okay.
Using Russian as kind of a lingua franca in a lot of countries, which is, increasingly kind of touchy. So I'm trying to localize my language knowledge, especially in Ukraine. I also now speak Ukrainian. But it opened up work in that part of the world for me. I did work a bit in forestry companies and a bit as a consulting forester in Maine first. But then I started working on, really around the issue of biodiversity conservation and managed forests, first in Ukraine, and then I spent almost 6 years in the Russian Far East, which is a story in itself, mind-blowing region. It's kind of like Northeast U.S., Maritime Canada with tigers and a lot more old growth and leopards and the world's largest owl and several bear species and just unbelievable forests.
Wow.
Yeah. So Ukraine's are a little less dramatic, but I also got sort of very deeply attached and engaged in forest management in Ukraine, and it's sort of difficult transition in this part of the world to new paradigms. That was what I was really working around, that question. Often it was just, what are we not going to cut? What high conservation value forests, how can we balance that with the needs of, commercial forest management, the timber industry? And so I did that for about 7 years between those two countries before Russia's first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, which was kind of a more slightly hidden invasion, which they preferred to depict as a civil war, but that's not true. It made my continuing work in the Russian Far East, impossible. I sort of gently got pushed out of Russia. It could have been a lot worse. And it just sort of immediately I thought to return to Ukraine because I had quite an emotional attachment to that country from working and living there and traveling all around it. But what happened was I got pulled out of forest management entirely for almost 6 years.
Wow.
And I did humanitarian and economic recovery work for USAID, which I'm actually just finishing up as we speak. That's been my job for about 6 years. It's been really hard to not be in forestry, but also it was very hard for me not to get involved in this work based on where my sort of heart and brains were taking me. So, and gradually I started getting involved in more as just sort of an interested party, like someone who just really wanted to scratch that part of my brain, but also I was living around these landscapes in eastern Ukraine. So this is the region that we sort of call the Donbas, right, which is currently being annihilated.
Okay.
Absolutely, utterly, systematically destroyed. If you've heard about places like Severodonetsk, where I was living, Bakhmut, Mariupol, of course, this is where I was working. Government-controlled parts of that region before Russia's second invasion that started in February of 2022. And I started getting involved in forestry issues, both in my work and just as someone who was really engaged. We had huge forest fires in the Luhansk region of the Donbas in 2020. Proportionally, they took out about a third of the pine forests in the region. Oh, wow. Which is very forest poor. So, for people, that was devastating. And a bit of a debate opened up. What next? And I really started getting involved in that public debate. So I just want to say that while, I'm really involved in this issue, I'm not, for instance, a Ukrainian forest practitioner of many years. And my views differ from some of them. I'm very happy to be in a really interesting sort of scientific and management debate. And some foresters there really like some of the directions that I and forest science colleagues in Ukraine talk about, maybe in the direction of working hydrology more into forest management decisions in a really dry landscape like eastern Ukraine. But the same forester might be like, yeah, but this stuff about natural regeneration is nonsense. We can't do that. And then a different forester will be vice versa. So it's a really interesting mix. I and some colleagues who I've worked with for a while, forest scientists and ecologists in Ukraine, we're really advocating for a bit of a pivot after the catastrophic fires caused by or sort of happening around these two invasions of eastern Ukraine that have massively complicated everything and are working together with climate change and a bunch of other factors to make just a really bad forest fire mechanism, which I think will be really familiar, except for the war parts, to Western North Americans. And we're saying it's time to pivot. It's time to think about different ways to manage this landscape. And that debate was beginning when the second invasion started. Of course, right now we're more sort of studying, but it's going to come back with a vengeance. And we really want to be there and be part of the debate.
Absolutely. Yeah. I was immediately struck when I first learned about the presentation you gave. That was through Yale University?
Yes. Yeah. Yale Forest Forum.
Yeah. That's right. My brain immediately went to the place of like, oh, right. Life goes on. Like, I think for those of us that have been fortunate enough to never be in a war zone or be in that situation with an invading army, we just kind of assume that like, okay, now it's full total war and you're not like, life doesn't go on. You're not worried about forests. You're not worried about fires. You're just worried about surviving and pushing back. And to learn that that life still goes on in Ukraine and that there is still space and to be able to think about these things like the sustainability of, Ukraine's forest future and that kind of thing. That was fascinating and eye-opening to me that's able to happen. And I think other people might feel the same way. So it was interesting to hear. And I like you said, right? I think your own journey points to that, right? Like when the invasion first happened, you were taken away for 6 years doing humanitarian, doing how do we survive this? How do we deal with this? And then, you were able to step back and step into more of your expertise. And that's, it's quite the situation. It's wild.
Yeah. I think in this situation, post this much more massive and many times more destructive second invasion, the sort of stepping into these, we had a very interesting sort of rehearsal for this debate from like 2018 to 2022 that I was somewhat involved in, fairly involved in. And I think we need to try to restart it with the forestry authorities, with other parts of the Ukrainian government, as soon as possible. There are already liberated forests that Ukrainian forces pushed Russian invaders out of, like, for instance, the Kharkiv region last year, which are forests along the same landscape that I'll be talking about, which is the valley of the Siversky Donets River. It's where all these pine forests are. They're already liberated. There are foresters out there, for instance, right now without a particularly changed mandate, trying to fight fires in a landscape massively contaminated by unexploded ordnance.
Yeah, which is a whole other thing. Yeah,
it's just and like so we need to ramp up and accelerate the discussion. And by looking for resources, Ukraine has just a million things on its plate. It's said that demining alone might cost $37 billion and take decades. So, there's so much on Ukraine's plate. There need to be resources and support for a Ukraine-driven process, about these forest landscapes that are now infinitely more tricky. And it was already an amazingly it was a fascinating management sort of knot to be thinking about just after the last invasion, which was, a fraction as destructive as this one.
Right. Yeah. I don't know if you know Alberta right now, where the whole province is on fire. It's surrounded. There's multiple communities but to think about the idea of fighting fires that are caused by explosions and then the firefighters having to deal with unexploded ordinances at the same time as they're fighting a wildfire. It's just like, damn, like I can't even imagine the complexity that goes into trying to do something like that. Yeah. Like it's my heart goes out to the people of Ukraine that are able to take on this challenge and make headway. Like it's incredible. It's just a real story of perseverance, right? Like it's incredible. Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's. I think before we continue, we're going to get into more of this. We're going to talk more specifically. I think I would like to get you to paint a picture of the Ukrainian forest for people, so people know what we're talking about, what kind of trees we're talking about, what's the landscape like, and then we can get into some land use and then the current situation. So yeah, if you can paint a picture for us of, we're talking about Ukrainian forest pre-war, so pre-Crimea invasion. What were we looking at?
So Ukraine's, not a forest giant, but because it's just a really big country, even when you're mostly, a farming country, you can pack some really interesting forests in here and there. The biggest forests are in the Carpathian Mountains in the west. I've worked there. Fascinating region. Those are like spruce fir, but not like wimpy Eastern North American fir, but like, big Western North American fir.
Right.
Spruce fir, beech, maple forests, fantastic. Wow. But they're a bit out of this discussion today. I mean, those are big forest massifs, hundreds of thousands of hectares up in the mountains. Then there's another region along the border, the northern border, called Polisia, which comes from the Ukrainian word lis, forest. It borders Belarus. It's like a big swamp forest mosaic. A lot of forest management up there. Scots pine mixed with peat bogs. And that's where Chernobyl is, which also was very affected by this second invasion. I mean, there were Russian soldiers digging trenches in some of the most radionuclide infected forests. I mean, probably slowly killing themselves. I mean, just absolute madness. And they caused a whole bunch more forests up there to burn, releasing their radionuclides.
A whole nother, that's I can't even wrap my brain around the idea of okay, so we're fighting forest fires. Watch out for explosions. By the way, one of the worst nuclear disasters, to ever happen. Yeah, we got to deal with that. So you should have a Geiger counter on you and, watch out for mutated bears or something. It's such a mess of a situation.
Yeah. And I can't even really speak to Chernobyl. I've just been there a few times. What I'll speak to today is this sort of other forest region of Ukraine. It's not a major forest region. As you head farther east and south, Ukraine gets more and more, it becomes forest steppe and then steppe. And then you have the Crimean Peninsula, which is, fantastic separate landscape. At the very tip of it, it's almost subtropical. There's like palm trees planted outside in the cities. And there's another sort of mountain forest landscape there. Again, I've actually never even been there. Let's just leave that aside as another amazing forest landscape of Ukraine. But I'm talking about the east, the sort of edge of the forest steppe and steppe climatic zones.
Okay. Can we describe, before we go on, can we describe steppe landscape, what that is first?
Well, today the Ukrainian steppe landscape is wheat and sunflowers.
Okay.
Big rolling, gently rolling landscape, black earth Chernozem soils, fantastic farmland. And so really the black earth, tall grass steppe, feathergrass steppe is sadly much, much, much more lost than even forest landscapes in Ukraine. It's left in some small reserves, little pockets, gullies, and it's gorgeous, swaying feathergrass, marmot, which is the Eurasian marmot. We call them baibak in Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine's one of its last real amazing outposts, also like northern Kazakhstan. Incredible animal. Spend a lot of time.
I like to call them land beavers. Yeah.
Yeah. They're little, landscape engineers. Some really interesting science about that from Kazakhstan, how they change the vegetation. So, that's an amazing landscape, and that's what's all around you, but it's, 96% converted to sunflower, corn, wheat, soy, farming.
Gotcha.
Then you've got this river punching through that region, heading northeast, southwest, called the Siversky Donets. Donets means the Little Don. It's a tributary of the Don River, which is one of European Russia's great rivers. But most of the Siversky Donets runs through Ukraine. And it's the biggest river in eastern Ukraine. It has a quite developed valley with terraces. And the lowest, the floodplain and the lowest terraces are these gorgeous mixed broadleaf forests. Look a lot like ones you'd find in eastern North America. Oak-dominated, ash, elm, linden, poplar terraces. But then the upper terraces are bone-dry sand terraces, and they're dominated by Scots pine, Pinus sylvestris. Native species to the region, but, in a very different arrangement now in the landscape than probably its pre-European settlement equivalent. Probably sounds familiar to some of the pine managers of, again, Western North America.
Right.
Mixed into these sandy landscapes on these terraces are patches of native sand steppe ecosystems, which are fascinating. They've held on as pastures around villages, and incredibly enough, the biggest remaining areas of these very low productivity but quite biodiverse sandy steppes are former Soviet tank training areas.
Oh, okay.
So there were like open steppes, and instead of them planting them to trees, the Soviet army was like, wait a minute, we need a place to drive tanks around and train, tank drivers. And then after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was thought, well, maybe we'll plant those all up to pine as well. And a couple of ecologists jumped in and said, no, wait a minute. This is an extremely disturbed landscape, but it's got, it's the last of the sandy steppe. And some of them are actually now strictly protected and are sort of gradually regenerating. So, and besides that steppe, there's also these little depressions surrounded by deciduous trees that are basically the few places that there's very much groundwater in the landscape. Oh, and they're also super important for biodiversity for obvious reasons. They're little islands of much more biodiverse broadleaf forest in this pretty, arid, semi-arid pine landscape. And it's a big ribbon, basically, along the Siversky Donets River. And there's also a whole bunch of industrial cities mixed into this landscape, which have become sadly well known because of this war. They've been, devastated, like Severodonetsk, where I lived, Rubizhna, Izyum, places like this. And these forests are really, really important to people in this very otherwise, quite kind of transformed landscape. It's either heavy industry, underground coal mining, rust belt industry, and intensive agriculture. And then you've got this oasis of pine and broadleaf forests running through it. So they have enormous significance to the people of eastern Ukraine.
Right.
And the way that fires have been transforming and fragmenting that landscape, especially since the late 80s, early 90s, and then accelerated greatly by two invasions, really is one more kind of trauma in a region that's got a lot of them on its plate.
No kidding. Just keep piling it on. Yeah, absolutely. And I think so it gives people a good idea for what we're talking about here. And you talked a lot in your presentation about the land use history, right? And obviously this is Europe we're talking about. This is, millennia of industrialized, agriculture and that kind of thing. Just a lot of deforestation, a lot of land clearing history. And so it's different from what, I'm used to dealing with, boreal Canada, right? And so, let's talk just a little bit about that to provide a little more context for the ecology, in regards to land use history with humans and how that plays a role. You talked about for example, you talked about the steppe lands being planted into pine and being kind of an unnatural version of that. I'll let you take it.
Well, I'd say that parts of eastern Ukraine are some of the last to really be colonized by Europeans in the Eurasian continent. Yeah.
Gotcha. I didn't know that.
I mean, if you don't get into Siberia, right? Into the European part of Eurasia, let's put it that way. And I really talk about Eurasia because these steppe landscapes are really part of the Eurasian steppe, which goes to Mongolia, basically.
Right.
And parts of them were what's called historically the wild field, Dika Polya. And that is basically this very contested landscape between empires that was really hard to permanently settle.
Okay.
So the Russian Empire and the Ottoman Empire were contesting these steppes of southern and eastern Ukraine. And they had these sort of roving bands of their own sort of militarized nomads. From the Russian Empire was Cossacks, from the Ottoman Empire was Tatars, clashing, sometimes cooperating, but generally keeping the territory from being a place you could have farmers settling. And so it maintained a wild steppe landscape much longer, albeit one very affected by their use of fire, which is not super well documented and understood. We know they used fire militarily against each other, but probably also, for grazing, for, producing the kind of steppe vegetation they wanted for their own management needs. Something you hear them talk about a lot, which is really interesting in old historic, 18th century documents, is these forests are full of wild apples and pears. We'll never go hungry. And, now we walk past, it's like an understory tree, oh, they're pretty, whatever. Those settlers, it was so important. It was we're saved. There's wild pear trees. And,
there's
so
food.
it was sort of, there's this very interesting early relationship that Slavic settlers had with this. But until the mid 18th century, when finally the Russian Empire got the upper hand, and it was really important for the empire to settle this territory as fast as possible to sort of secure its gains. And they start tilling the steppe. The pine forests get really badly hit by these kinds of early settler industries that needed tons of firewood. And there weren't a lot of forests. So they really started badly affecting those forests. And, then the sheep come in and you get basically, you got shifting dunes of sand. And that's really the perception that you come into the modern era with, is this friggin' wasteland.
Okay, yeah.
And it's very similar to early U.S. Forest Service, probably some of these dynamics in Canada. We are going to make something useful out of this useless and harmful, wasteland.
Always trying to make something productive, right? In quotations,
right. And at this point, we're talking the late 1800s. So these are Russian Tsarist era, early foresters. This is people that inspired Gifford Pinchot. He wrote about Russian foresters, Russian imperial foresters. Actually, very often they're Germans, interestingly enough. But anyway, they're out there saying yeah, you know what? These sandy steppes, we try to graze them and they just turn into, shifting sands. Stick some pine in this, So they start pining the landscape, heavy duty, all up and down this degraded landscape of the Siversky Donets River Valley.
So afforesting this previously,
reforesting the pine forests that were lost, and afforesting the sandy steppe. Some places with dense pine forests, closed canopy. Those tend to be where there's a lot of groundwater. You got aquifers. One of those today is the Kremena forest, which is presently being pounded into basically matchsticks by the Russian army. It's the most foresty forest in the east because you really feel it, it's drawing on a groundwater resource. Whereas a lot of everything else was probably something like a pine woodland transitioning to a savanna, transitioning to open steppe on sand. So pine is native here, but it only in certain places that had exceptionally good water resources did you probably have closed canopy. And even they probably were somewhat reminiscent of, a gorgeous, somewhat parklandish pine, ponderosa pine forest.
Gotcha. I want to show some appreciation for the sentence you just coined, the most foresty forest. And we spend so much time in the English language trying to find the words that paint a picture in people's minds, but that just nailed it. It was perfect. I was the most foresty forest. I'm yes.
Thank
you for that.
Well, because there's a lot of variations on forest. If you look at what probably was there that, wouldn't immediately go, oh, that's forest for a lot of people. Yeah. It'd be that's kind of a grassland with a bunch of pines sticking around. Here and there, they're denser around water. There's a patch of birch trees around or alder trees around a wet depression. It was a mosaic. It was a forest steppe mosaic on a sandy landscape. And it's inherited after maybe 150 years of agricultural degradation as mostly a shifting sand, disaster. So the Tsarist foresters start, really leaning in, planting. There's a few plantings from the mid 1800s. They're amazing. They look today like incredible old growth, perfect, uneven age, lots of dead wood, lots of complexity pine forests, but they were planted by Tsarist troops actually in the mid 1800s. There's a little tiny patches of them. They're amazing. They're in the war zone. I don't know if they're going to make it out. And actually, clearly they were using in that early afforestation, some lower densities of planting, which is awesome because basically you got essentially a self-sustaining pine forest that eventually becomes uneven aged. Whereas the Soviet approach was like, pack those trees in. It starts to look like, like a lodgepole. It's like, get them in there, maximize your biomass per hectare, maximize growth of the forest for, the people's needs. And when Soviet foresters inherit this from Tsarist Russia, when the Russian Empire collapses and Soviet Union starts up, they massively accelerate the planting. And like I said, dense pine plantations get planted. And under socialism, they, of course, wanted to make money off of this stuff, but, market impulses were kind of muffled. And a lot of stuff was done just for the sort of the campaign effect. And so the Soviet approach was to pine up this landscape wall to wall. As I said, at some point, steppe in the sandy landscape is left only in pastures and tank training grounds. And, it's an enormous benefit to the people of eastern Ukraine compared to a shifting sand dune. People loved these forests. They got a lot of wood out of them. All the coal mines of the Donbas, the famous Donbas coal mines are, all the shafts are supported with pine beams. Lots of homes in the region are made with, pine lumber from these forests they made with their own hands. They're beautiful. They smell like an air freshener. But especially this super high density forests, you start having downsides that become more and more apparent with climate change. And basically, this is the landscape as it for most of the Soviet period, right up to, the, childhood of a lot of people our age now, in that part of the world. People really know forests like this, this sort of wall of pine, that you sort of step into from the hot baking, fields into this, dark, dense, no understory often, pine plantation.
Right.
With patches of more natural remnant pine forests. They're here and there. They're amazing. They're often sort of semi-uneven aged and regenerate naturally very well, which often led some of us to say, look at that. We can replicate that with management. It is being managed. You're picking away at it. It's like single tree selection sometimes, group selection, like go for it. This works well with this ecosystem. But Ukraine inherited from the Soviet Union this super production intensity approach in a very difficult landscape, arid, water stressed. And that's where the debate comes. Maybe we can have some of that and some other things, because late 80s, especially, climate change really starts catching up with Eastern Ukraine. All the climate change, dynamics in this part of the world are, pretty familiar. Steadily rising temperatures, precipitation's getting concentrated instead of being well spread out, creating really dry periods. It gets concentrated into downpours that then the landscape can't hold very well. So, lots more drought days than you previously had. And then like growing intensity of dry winds. So this is picking up from the late 80s and coincides with the collapse of the Soviet Union, which is, among many other things, a huge drop in state capacity to do a lot of things. Yeah. Ukraine and other post-Soviet countries are stepping in, building a state. So many less people working in the woods, less firefighters, less equipment, combined with a landscape that, land use history has turned into a tinderbox. You've got smallholder and industrial agriculture using fire in not very responsible ways, and then reduced state capacity and climate change. And I'm giving you all the factors that you then add war to.
Right. Which
is crazy. So I'm talking about before the war. You've got all these things coming together.
Yeah.
And of course, this pine plantation landscape, with its patches of natural pine, tiny patches of sandy steppe, and then, neighboring broadleaf forests, it starts breaking up, starts coming apart at the seams because of fires. Coming out of agricultural lands, usually, not always, sometimes started in the forest. Almost never a lightning fire. I mean, we were talking about anthropogenic forests being burned for anthropogenic reasons. There's really there's not much of a dynamic of dry lightning in this part of the
Gotcha.
It starts fragmenting. Usually the foresters then run in and successfully, they do, salvage logging and successfully replant to pine, but essentially start a new generation of the same tinderbox.
Just replace, yeah, right.
Replace, yeah. Also, their capacity to do the kinds of thinnings done in the Soviet Union goes down because a lot of them were pre-commercial thinnings. And so you get actually forests planted at densities where then there was an expectation you were going to lower the density. They're not able to do it anymore because there isn't enough budget.
So now
then you're
crowding.
So let's talk about lowering the planting density. Well, our laws don't provide that option. Kind of straitjacketed laws that are inherited and only sort of tweaked from Soviet times.
Yeah. That's always an issue with changing forest policy, right?
Yeah.
It's just like, well, the policy says this. I'm like, the policy's old and outdated. We should be changing it. Why are we afraid to change it?
Yeah, the landscape's changing around us, but it's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard.
It's
hard. A lot of times in this part of the world, people think if you give more flexibility to foresters, they're going to abuse it. There's not a lot of trust in forest managers in Ukraine and Russia. There's a lot of suspicion, not always fair, of corruption. And if, you give them loopholes, they're going to abuse them. Now, I mean, huge debate around that. Lots of foresters saying we deserve more trust. I think they're often right. There's some real bad apples among them that spoil the whole thing.
Of course.
But it's a long-standing thing that sort of really strict regulations are used in this part of the world to make the public feel there isn't going to be abuse. But then the landscape and the climate are changing around you, and the legislation's very slowly keeping up.
Yeah.
So you have this whole dynamic. And then in 2014, you add war.
Yeah.
Ukraine has a revolution. Russia really doesn't like who wins the revolution. A lot of people in eastern Ukraine are unhappy about it. I won't get too deep into the politics, but let's just say there are people there with a lot of people there with worldview that Russia's able to sort of take advantage of, send in quietly their troops, make it look like a civil war. They get this whole invasion going, and Ukraine fights back, and you get artillery warfare going on in and around these forests because a lot of the communities are near them because they're near the river.
Right.
And as of 2014, some regions that actually have escaped the real heavy damages of this invasion get devastated, like Stanitsa Luhanska, which is right on the Ukrainian-Russian border on the river, Nova Aidar. They get, in the summer of 2014, you get tons of artillery flying around, starts fires, burns maybe 10,000 hectares. In the Luhansk region, that's a lot. But they only have a couple 100,000.
Right.
Period. And then a ton of landscapes get contaminated with unexploded ordnance, which can be landmines, tripwires, bombs that haven't gone off, shells that haven't exploded. So a lot of these sandy pine forests start burning. And of course, it gets harder to fight fires there.
Yeah, of course. Yeah,
of course.
You have to avoid explosives and, explosive caused wildfires, and like war as a disturbance,
is great.
I can't even,
it's a source of ignition. It physically grinds forests up. Like right now in Kremena, in Luhansk Oblast, it's starting to look like Verdun, right, in France.
Oh, wow.
I mean, just like the trees are just broken off at halfway by all the artillery flying around.
Wow.
It's insane. It's not even necessarily fire. It's just mechanical destruction of forests by artillery. Mature pine forests. It's quite something. And it also, war accelerates state capacity decline because, this area becomes a militarized zone. It's harder and harder to get forest firefighters out there. They actually pull some of the sort of civilian firefighting capacity out of the region because it's frontline war zone, although people continue to live there.
Right.
You get soldiers holding positions in the forests along the river. They're burning trash. They're throwing cigarette butts. They're human beings, right? You get fire being used in warfare again, shooting tracer bullets into dry grass around each other's positions, but the Ukrainian armies primarily who's in the forest, the Russian/separatist forces on the other side of the river are in a different landscape. It's so when forests are being deliberately burned, it's generally that side doing it to the Ukrainians, trying to smoke them out, basically.
Yeah.
That happened a lot in 2020. So you get all these, things blowing up in a dry forest, right? And often, fires usually are coming out of village agricultural lands into the forest, and that's sort of a place you meet them and fight them. When you get, heavy artillery flying into the middle of your forest massive, exploding and starting a fire, I mean, fighting fires just becomes insane.
I can't even begin to fathom, and the fact that they're still fighting fires is wild to me. I would have thought that immediately you're like, no, there's a war. Don't worry about the trees. Let's take care of the lives. But when you start to think more completely about the issue, you realize, no, the trees are part of the living here, and you need.
And so is the farming. So are the farmers who hit landmines and have been hitting them the last 10 years in eastern Ukraine and sometimes die. The head forester of Novy Dar told me, of course there are places we tried not to go into, but eventually it's you have to use the whole landscape to fight fires. Of course, sometimes we had to be in places, with UXO, unexploded ordnance contamination. He said there was one point they were fighting, hand fighting a fire, a Legrand fire, and it got into what was probably an abandoned earlier military position, like trenches, shallow trenches, and a box full of ammunition exploded.
Oh, geez.
He and the other guys just hit the decks. They're all face down in the sand while, basically, essentially bullets are flying around them because this box of ammunition ignited.
It's
the
so dangerous. You can't even it's just so random too, right?
Yeah. The head forester in Stanitsa Luhanska told me, we older guys, getting closer to our pension, when a fire starts, we'll show up and tell the local district forester, hey, get out of here, go back. You got kids. We'll go in and fight the fire because this is a wartime landscape. We know, and they had a fire truck, a forest fire truck hit a landmine a couple years ago. They fixed it up, got it back going. The same driver was driving it.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I know. Now that's all occupied now. It's under Russian control.
Talk about tough, eh? Just wild.
Yeah, wild. So I mean, life goes on, but gets a lot harder. Stanitsa Luhanska is a fascinating landscape because a lot of forests there burned, and they were able to salvage some. Imagine that, doing salvage logging in those conditions with sort of intuitive demining,
Oh, I see. Okay.
They were able to salvage some, and actually that landscape superbly regenerated. Massive hats off to the foresters around Stanitsa. They very carefully dealt with one of the most difficult forest landscapes imaginable. Salvaged some of that material for local people. There's a lot of greenhouse farmers there. They cut tons of firewood for them. Dry pine's great for firing up a greenhouse. Some construction materials. They kept their budget replenished. Provided some local needs, carefully left absolutely any tree with cones in it, even if they saw it was dying in front of their eyes, and got fantastic natural regeneration.
Nice seed. Yeah.
Absolutely fantastic, which is really a message actually going forward that this landscape does have natural regeneration capacity, which is a thing that you get a lot of pushback on. A lot. And we've been saying for several years, it worked in Stanitsa Luhanska. Why do we think it can't work somewhere else? They were necessitated not to do heavy planting by the fear of unexploded ordnance. They did some patch planting, filling gaps, but they mostly got great natural regen. That maybe is coming back in ways that are a bit patchier, a bit less even, and we should be happy with that. That's okay.
Right?
Yeah,
Yeah, natural patterns of disturbance, right? That's mosaic is what you want.
Maybe a little more sensitivity to the local hydrology. Maybe, so even in those conditions, forest management goes on. I wasn't going to say they're making a lot of money over there. They never did, but I mean, they sort of shifted and kept being foresters and doing forest management and forest fire control in a UXO contaminated landscape. I think Stanitsa really does sort of tell us a bit about what the rest of this region is going to face. But, it's massively difficult. I mean, among other things, commercial forest management there becomes really difficult. I saw them they had these little hand metal detectors, wands, at the airport, and they would wave them over logs. Oh, beep, beep, beep. Oh, we got some shrapnel here. And they're like Swiss cheesing logs to get all the shrapnel out.
I didn't even thought about that. Yeah. So, yeah. Oh my God.
I mean, in some parts of the world where you have metal in the trees for different reasons, you got big metal detectors that the tree goes through like an MRI machine. They didn't have the budget for that, so they were waving wands over all their logs, and then it builds up, adds up all these different ways. This complicates, but life goes on in eastern Ukraine. Yeah,
wild.
But that's all after the first invasion. That's just the first one.
That's not even
that complicates life that much. What it really does is brings down the capacity so much that in 2020 you get a climatic perfect storm for massive forest fires. Like, I was living there at the time. I mean, it just didn't rain in the spring. We just didn't get rain, and late spring into summer, and then these winds came in that felt like somebody had turned a hairdryer on in your face.
Ugh.
And it's just blowing this dense pine plantation landscape bone dry. And the war contributed definitely, this is, the first war, to that disaster when then 30,000 hectares burned. I think 17 people died who just couldn't evacuate fast enough from little villages and dachas in the forest. Some
terrible
villages just mowed by flame.
It's like a blowtorch at that point.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that's what my colleague Sergei Zipsev, who's Ukraine's sort of wildfire leading expert, he was like, we have Greece or California in eastern Ukraine now. We have never seen fires like this. We've never seen fires that move this fast. We can't fight them with all the ways we used to. If you don't catch them in the first hour, you're done. Like, you don't put them out. Nature puts them out, or maybe aviation, but they couldn't use aviation because there's a war nearby.
Of course.
It was a low-level war at that point, but not so low level that the Russians might not shoot down a plane.
Yeah, no kidding.
So the war brought down state capacity, hobbled it in a way that even without active fighting, I definitely consider that 30,000 hectares to be war caused. Again, because you couldn't use aviation, because there weren't civilian firefighters down in the region. And then just any spark caused that massive conflagration. It was, one transformer exploded in one village. The spark, the lines fell down, set the grass on fire, got into the forest, and burned 10,000 hectares. Maybe soldiers were burning trash. Villagers were burning dry weeds. Maybe the Russians fired some shots across to ignite the grass, and anything and everything just set the whole landscape on fire.
Yeah.
This ribbon of pine forest running through the landscape, it was just burning everywhere.
Yeah.
And that was really the moment that a lot of us started saying, myself, like Sergei, a lot of his colleagues from the National Bioresources University, a lot of forest ecologists in the country, like, if we just plant the status quo again, we're just going to keep dealing with this. Climate and fire are fragmenting this landscape. Scots pines got the ability to grow in very different ways than we're growing it, including commercially, right? Can we talk about this? Yeah, we know the law straitjackets you, but let's begin experimenting. And there was a lot of interest, actually, I'd say willingness. We started looking, Sergei started leading a process to do basically urban wildland interface, but village wildland interface around unburned villages, bring down the density, create more park-like pine forests that adjut, these villages of houses with, surrounded by dry grass and, dead fruit trees and wooden roofs. I mean, it was a nightmare, ready to explode. We started talking about, if you give it time, natural regeneration will start filling in these burned areas. But if you come in 2 years with an inspector that says, hey, you haven't reached your density yet, you're fired or you're fined, well, then you can't use natural regen. You need to be a little bit more patient with nature in an arid landscape. if you're going to plant, let's take these extremely unproductive sandy sites. And, why are we growing matchsticks there? You're probably never going to get commercial timber here. What if we had a savanna? What if we at least just had wider spaced trees that might, faster accumulate that insulating bark and don't have touching crowns, etc.? And there was a great debate. Why don't we start thinking about hydrology? As I said, there's these little patches of wetlands, little mini ponds, little deciduous forests mixed through the landscape. Actually being surrounded by dense pine plantations over decades was drying them all out. So in those kinds of landscape, can we bring pine back to this landscape in a way that it doesn't suck dry? I mean, it's basically respirating faster than, the rainwater's accumulating. And that whole debate happened, and it was really interesting, and I think we can restart it. But I would say it started really picking up steam. We started laying out, experimental plot areas. And then on the radio, it's like Russian troops, accumulating on the Russian border or Ukrainian border. And it was like, oh man, there's no way they want to restart a big war here. It's not useful to anybody, themselves included. This isn't going to happen. And then it did. February 2022, they just smashed across the border into this region. And it becomes the epicenter of the epicenter of the very worst fighting of the war. The river makes forests possible. The river is a great place to set up a defensive line. So forests get disproportionately affected by the war because they're near the river, and they're also a good place to hide. They're a good place to put artillery in, to build positions in. It's terrifying, I think, being in an army position dug into a sunflower field,
oh my God. Yeah. No,
I mean, out there in those landscapes, they're hiding in the shelter belts, basically. Again, hugging the trees, trying to get a little bit of cover. So then the second war just brings a level of destruction that, we can learn lessons from the first invasion and the war and the way it affected this landscape. But, what we got on our hands now is just something many, many, many times worse.
Right. Just much more destruction, much more fire, much more unexploded ordinances, making it difficult to even walk into the bush, let alone manage it or make decisions on it or, send in planters to plant because they might explode. It's such a, Yeah. So, now we're dealing with, essentially, I think going forward, some of these things might need to happen, which is, first of all, just a total different management approach to this landscape. I think the Siversky Donets needs to be treated the same way. That's, the river and its valley and the landscape around it. This most deeply affected natural landscape of Ukraine by the war probably needs to get some kind of similar status to the Chernobyl exclusion zone, where some of the rules are off. You get to be a little more creative in your management. Right.
A little, at least in your fire management, because this is crazy. This is not like other landscapes around you. Obviously, in a landscape now that's just so crazily dangerous, the principle, you got to get that fire in its first hour, becomes paramount. That's the firefighting principle at this point. So, you need a firefighting force with jurisdiction everywhere.
Yeah. Fight the fire, period. Don't worry about where it is. Fight the fire. Yeah.
Of course, prevent the fire. Again, we're talking about a landscape without dry lightning. So, you could make most of this fire go away. Sadly, one thing that'll make it go away is just depopulation of this war-devastated region. But, of course, prevent the fire in any way possible. But if it starts, you got to have the right to fight it wherever it darn well is.
Yeah, just do it. Yeah.
They're going to need some amazing technology to do that. Thankfully, there is some out there. The Germans developed firefighting tanks for UXO-contaminated landscapes.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So basically, East Germany had a whole bunch of these tank training grounds, like I was talking about at the beginning, like a lot of them. And all of the countries in the Warsaw Pact that, was like the counterbalance of socialist countries to NATO, they would do training in East Germany. In sandy pine forests. It's a great place for that. And they contaminated the heck out of some landscapes that the Germans have essentially recognized they can never fully demine.
Right.
So they manage them with fire, and they put out fires with tanks.
That's insane. Like I can't.
It's like a tank with a water cannon, basically.
Firefighting tanks.
Yeah, firefighting tanks.
Oh my goodness.
So
why not? I guess, right? Why not?
Why not? Yeah. So I mean, Ukraine's going to need a whole bunch of those for a landscape like this.
Yeah, no kidding.
But those are kind of practical aspects of fire management. Then there's just
practical firefighting tanks. I like that. That's good.
Demining. Ukraine's got, decades of demining ahead of it. Demining is slow. It's expensive. Of course, priority is going to be around communities and farmland. Ukraine's a leading agricultural exporter. And farmland is conceivably deminable. Forests are it's an art. Demining the forests. It's done, but it's also, it's not done with the kind of certainty that you can demine other parts of the landscape. Yeah. Some places in the world have not tried and basically made heavily mined areas off limits, especially in montane forests. Some have just said this is part of life, and people still occasionally step on landmines.
I can't even imagine that kind of a threat. Just I'm going to go for a hike and watch out for landmines. What?
There were places in the landscape that I explored quite, I had mountain biking out there, tons of hiking, driving around, backroading. There were places I knew to stay away from. Now, the whole landscapes, there will be places you might go to relax knowing there aren't landmines there.
Right.
Now, it's inverted now. So, what will forest demining look like? Of course, you're going to need probably, I think, a triage approach. You can't demine this whole landscape. Maybe there could be demining of the most commercially viable forests first.
What does demining look like? What do you do? How does one go about demining?
You're out there with metal detectors and crawling on hands and knees, inching forward with, people with screens and heavy body armor on.
Really? So it's very intensive.
It's intensive. You're poking through the vegetation.
My God.
Yeah.
I assumed that there was some kind of machine you could use to drive through and just kind of roll, slightly touch.
In agricultural lands, more and more, they're using essentially just sort of it's you send a little robot dozer through. Ukrainians in their amazing ingenuity have rigged up old tractors with remote control.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
All this drone technology has taught people how to do a lot of, remote and they're just they put a big cattle catcher on the front of a tractor and they're just going through their farmlands, setting off, unexploded ordnance. That's called black demining because it's not official and nobody will give you a certificate. But, if you've got 1,000 hectares of wheatland and that's been your life's work, you're not going to wait 10 years for the deminers to come.
Got to protect home. Yeah.
I think foresters are looking at this damn, plus side, again, these are dry sand. So the bottomland hardwood forests, I don't even know how those could be demined. I'll be honest. I have no idea. Yeah. They're jungly,
Just really thick. Yeah.
They're thick. Yeah. You get multiple, you get oak above, then maybe a mid-story of maples, and then a thick, shrub and herb layer.
Right.
They're dark and dense and wonderful when you, in the hot Ukrainian summer. But I'm trying to imagine, dead logs on the ground. I don't know about that. Sandy, open pine forests, even if, they're either open because it's basically no understory or because it was kind of park-like. Yeah, maybe. It's more conceivable. They're pretty flat.
Yeah.
You got pine and grass, basically. So, but you're still going to have to triage this. So, obviously triage is, start with forests around communities. But then, where do we have maybe living pine forests, productive, commercially viable for plantation and silviculture? Maybe some of those get prioritized. Maybe some really badly damaged, lower productivity forests, we let them regenerate the way they did in Stanitsa Luhanska, and maybe that's their fate for the rest of their existence. Maybe we're going to let some of those landscapes do their thing, knowing that there's likely a vegetation mosaic that can return. It may not look like what we're used to. We sometimes may not like the way it looks, but it probably will keep the sand down, might give us better results with hydrology. What we're not going to get out of it probably is so much pine timber. But it's also just an insanely dangerous landscape now. So that's probably something we can reconcile ourselves to. And then maybe we have some that, can be, hopefully some of these don't need to be demined. I mean, that's part of demining is just determining what areas. But I think, we're talking about many tens of thousands of hectares and maybe a few 100,000 if you take the whole Seversky Donetsk River Valley contaminated with UXOs. No one knows for sure. Many tens of thousands at least. So, prioritizing, letting some of them probably become, how you're going to keep people out of there not to pick mushrooms.
Yeah.
I don't know. I don't know.
That's such an unsurmountable obstacle to try and tackle. Like it's like, what a friggin' waste. Hey, like, it's just like, what the hell?
I mean, before the big invasion, the last 10, 8 years before it, there was a slow trickle of people getting handicapped or killed, going out to fish near the river, going out to pick mushrooms. I mean, it was a part of life, hitting them when they were on their tractors or their bush hogs. Now there's going to be less people for a while, but massively more dangerous landscape. And this isn't deep in the mountains. I'm not quite sure how you're going to say, like, folks, we can't demine some of these areas. We're letting nature take over. They're probably going to become a pine savanna. Please don't go there. Keep your cows out of there. I don't know how that's going to work.
What do you do? Like that changes the entire culture.
It's a life way. It changes a life way, definitely.
Totally. Like in new Ukrainians that are growing up in this reality, like they won't have that same experience or value towards nature because they can't experience it the same way. And
absolutely not.
It's a tragedy.
People in Izium, which is a pretty big city, not big city, but it's maybe 60,000 people in the Kharkiv region, devastated at the beginning of the war, and the forests around it badly burned and contaminated. Yeah, they said we were like cooped up in our little, mostly wrecked city. Like we used to wander, like you can't go down to the river, you can't go out in the woods. They're surrounded by the biggest forest in eastern Ukraine, the Izium forest, and they're just like, definitely a part of home for them is gone. I mean, and people talk about we're cooped up in a wrecked city. About 80% of the homes there have been damaged or destroyed. So like. We don't have a psychological release, which traditionally for us and much less stressful was the forest. It was always our where we let off steam.
We're drawn to it.
Trauma to be processing, and they can't do it out in their pine forests or down by their beautiful river.
It's consistent, like, tragedy after tragedy after challenge after challenge after there's no respite. Like it's almost unfathomable to think about like how you challenge this, right? Like it's just how you tackle this. It's like first and foremost you have to win a war, and then you got to deal with all these contaminated forests that are deadly now because of this wasteful landmines and unexploded ordinances. And you got to somehow return forests from, the incredible amount of fire that hasn't been seen there before, and try and turn it into something that is livable. And I can't even, and then you get back to the academic side of things and you go, okay, what good is the ecological knowledge we had before? Like how do we apply what we knew about forests to this new landscape that now exists that is completely different? Like, does there have to be a new field of study created to start researching and managing and understanding how, like, because obviously the ecology is going to be changing, right? There's going to be a lot more mosaic structure filled with landmines. Like I can't even, like, this. There's so many challenges to this. It's baffling.
And the first step is, really, please, let's have the right debate right now and maybe release the status quo.
Forget about it. Like, we're not there anymore. This doesn't apply.
Because there is a mechanism that will click into effect with enormous effort and heroic amounts of work, and you will get lots of pines in the ground and they will look great, but just, hold up, because, there's a lot of momentum that will make that status quo be where you're heading for.
Yeah.
Now, some of it will simply be impossible, like it was in that place I was talking about, Stanitsa Luhanska. They simply couldn't do status quo plantation silviculture, and they ended up with something else. And personally, I think it's better in certain ways.
Right.
It's, they lost, there's places they can't harvest timber. Timber, was burned. I do not want to sugarcoat their experience, but I think the landscape they ended up with is a more climate resilient and probably more biodiverse landscape than certainly more biodiverse landscape than they started with.
Yeah.
It's better positioned for the climate that they're living in than the pine plantations that would have been their status quo. Now we're talking about, that was one corner of the Siversky Donets landscape, which crosses 3 provinces. Okay, so let's look at that experience and say, we can let go of the status quo in some places. We can do it in some places. Absolutely no one's saying let's not ever practice plantation silviculture. Let's not ever plant high density, high production pine plantations again. But maybe they've got a place in the landscape. Maybe natural regeneration silviculture using group selection with Scots pine, which there is great experience in the region with, in sort of little patches here and there where for various, usually legislative reasons, they had to do that instead of plantations, and it works great.
Yeah.
And maybe in some places we're letting the steppe and the pine trees and the birch trees in the wetter spots and the alders work it out in their own mosaic, because it isn't worth risking somebody's life to plant pine trees here.
Totally. It sounds a lot like you're like, hey, like what you had was working for you. We don't have that anymore.
Yeah.
Let's use this wildly unfortunate tragedy and disaster to start again. Let's start over.
Yeah.
Let's decide. We can make decisions on the landscape that are applicable to today, that are the best decisions. And it doesn't mean we should be using the policy of the past.
Yeah.
And yeah, I'm also struck with the challenge of knowing that a war-torn area like Ukraine that is trying to just hold on right now, right? Trying to survive and have a lifestyle and create economic opportunity and all those kind of things. I'm also struck with the idea that biodiversity and climate resilience might not be at the top of their list. The top of their list might be, how do we feed people?
Yeah.
And we feed people by producing lumber that we can sell to the market and that we can. Yeah. So how do you put forth that argument about, creating climate resilient forests and biodiversity and long-term success in a place that is, just trying to survive?
Yeah. I mean, it's tricky, but I mean, the sort of cold-blooded way to do it is to say with some of these production forests that are on really low productivity sites, like, if we really compared the amount of time spent, the amount of times you had to replant, go back in and plant, because sometimes, drought takes out the trees, or maybe they got burned and you replant it again, plus the cost of time. Are you making money on these forests?
I see. Okay.
I can definitely see you imagine you're making money over there where, site index is way higher, natural productivity is higher. You're certainly making money cutting some of the leftover natural forests because you didn't have to spend any money establishing them. Are you sure we're making money here? And if we're not, then especially when Ukraine's facing, unprecedented economic disaster, it's going to have to spend money on so many different things.
Yeah.
Is trying to plant up with high density pine a landscape that doesn't really want to be growing that the best use of your resources? That's sort of the cold-blooded argument. Right, and then when it also means, that it's a dangerous landscape to be working in and you're putting people's lives at risk potentially to do some of this plantation management, there's a lot of strikes against it.
Yep.
I think where you're going to hear that argument is over in Western Ukraine in the mountains, where there's been a lot of effort to set aside what's called virgin forests, adapt forest management to be more in line with natural effort by ecologists and some foresters with a lot of pushback from other foresters. I think that where you can do large scale logging, there's no mines to worry about, and they make money exporting that wood to Europe. I think you're going to hear it there. In the East, I think that's actually, it's just not a super strong argument that like we got to plant up because we're going to plant these pines and in like 75 years we'll make some money off of them. It's just I mean, it's not really so that's the sort of cold-blooded, and but the more sort of like, hey, let's make people, see that this isn't just, sorry folks, there's no money to have your forests anymore. Right. Get used to it. We certainly can have forests here again. Again, Scots pine did pretty well in some war-damaged landscapes we saw after 2014. Right. It's going to look different, but, we started talking to a lot of people in communities about things that'll sound super familiar to people who take, urban wildland interface principles out to homeowners in Western North America, right? Mm-hmm. This forest over here, kind of park-like, bit less trees with bigger, beautiful crowns that aren't touching each other. That helps when you get those crown fires coming through. Right. And actually, folks, isn't this nice? And look, some of your neighbors are grazing goats over here because you don't have basically just a crunchy layer of pine needles underfoot. Because grass can grow in this kind of a low-density pine forest as well. And then you start bringing in climate, which is, a tough topic sometimes with rural people everywhere, although they most intuitively feel the climate is changing, like we all experience this. It's kind of, I don't know about that, but fire is this incredible expression of climate change, and boy, are they
gets people to pay attention. Yeah. Gets people to pay attention. Yeah.
So, we can, notice, people notice those things like the little ponds disappeared when the pine grew up. We need a lot of tools in our toolbox now in this landscape. Yeah. And we basically had one tool for a while that just has slight variations used across the landscape, across the pine landscape. And just, it isn't even really possible to do that anymore. But the discussion, the debates really got to catch up then with what is possible. And, what I really feel it's a mixture of plantation silviculture in certain places that will now be partially determined by where it's safe to work.
Yeah.
Natural regeneration silviculture, which is taking a lot more into consideration, structure and biodiversity. You're trying to get more things out of that landscape, but it includes timber and some forest steppe landscapes that they're going to do their own thing, and they'll largely be determined by productivity and danger. And that's kind of actually a description of the triad, which is a land management approach that my silviculture professor, Bob Seymour at UMaine, helped think up with some other people a couple decades ago, and is greatly applied all over the world. I think you kind of have to get to a triad approach.
I think the triad approach is coming in everywhere. Like that's, BC is talking about it. Alberta is kind of discussing it a little bit, and everywhere I can think of, there's people saying this triad approach of having areas of complete, conservation, areas of, continuous cover forestry, and then areas of intense
silviculture,
silviculture, plantation silviculture, where you get most of your. I think that's the case for pretty much everywhere, and it's hedging your bets, right? In this area of climate change where we don't know exactly what the future holds, and it's like why wouldn't you apply that in a place like Ukraine? I mean, there's 15 more intense challenges to overcome as well as,
I mean, now, I would have said a triad was a great approach in Eastern Ukraine before war added all of this, where, it would have been determined by site productivity, biodiversity value. Now we have to, the over dominating features that will determine zoning of this landscape will be safety. Yeah. Will be safety.
Yeah,
is there enough? Of course. Is this demined? Is it, safe enough to work in, or is it just impossible? And probably some of the really great biodiversity areas, unfortunately, will be really accessible. You'll have a lot of really hard decisions to make because this won't necessarily line up very well with the way you would have zoned the landscape before. But what I'm really afraid is if you don't zone and you start rolling the status quo out, I'm afraid of tragedies. Foresters losing their lives, etc.
Of course,
that will cause a what's the word I'm looking for? A blowback, And then it'll be like, just lock up and throw away the key on this landscape.
Yeah.
So, I think the triad is also a triage for safety and for what's possible, in this landscape. And it's my professional opinion, the sooner you get around to thinking of it that way, the better. But that's not something that all Ukrainian foresters and forestry officials would agree with.
Right.
A lot of scientists, some foresters would, a lot of ecologists would. Ukraine has a strong ecological civil society. So let's debate. Let's talk it out. I mean, I think it's the biggest message.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Do you think you're going to see much traction with these conversations now, or do you think it's not really going to start happening until this crisis kind of, ends?
I think some initial thinking will happen now.
Yeah.
And, people who want to talk about it need to bring it up. And we're trying.
Yeah.
But, it's hard. Some of the really great foresters and ecologists you want to have this conversation with are on the front.
Right.
Some of them have already been lost.
Yeah.
Have lost their lives defending their country. A lot of people are pretty distracted. But, it isn't like no life goes on and no management decisions get made in Ukraine during the war.
Yeah.
Ukraine just went through another round of reform of its forest management system, which reform of forestry in Ukraine usually means downsizing of that sort of relictual Soviet forest management system, down. Sometimes in ways that seem to make a lot of sense, but you're generally always having less and less professionals in the system. That's difficult. This is happening in the context of, an agency that is massively less resourced than, for instance, U.S. Forest Service or, other, public land managers in Canada. So it'll be a big challenge. Some people left the system after these latest reforms that, among other things, are just really centralizing. They're taking more authority for the center away from small forest management units, especially economic authority.
Gotcha.
So it'll be a big challenge.
Right. Yeah.
It has to be Ukraine driven. It has to be based on, the accumulated experience of a lot of Ukrainian steppe foresters. But they need a lot of support from abroad in research, funding. But, the challenge there will really not be to just sort of have, kind of people parachuting in to solve the problem.
Right.
The foresters I worked with there often just had an incredible accumulated knowledge of their landscape that then they would try to use through the straitjacket of their rules. Some of the rules are good, some are bad, but whatever the case is, they straitjacketed them. And, part of it would just be release some of these people to be more experimental in there, and they will figure a lot of things out themselves.
Yeah, let's try some stuff. Let's trust the people that know this area best and have made it their lives to, dedicated their lives to making sure that this place is sustainable and productive and holds the values that the public want. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah, but let's also let the scientists and the ecologists in as well, because Ukrainian foresters are pretty conservative too, and they don't have all the ideas. I mean, let's really open this up. I mean, it's just let's talk this out.
Yeah.
Do not let the mechanism of the status quo just click into effect and then start rolling into this incredibly dangerous landscape, and God only knows. So I don't think it'll be easy. Outsiders can help. But it's really going to be driven by Ukrainian stakeholders, and I don't see those people walking away from the debate. I mean, there's one of the guy who runs WWF Ukraine's forest program. He's out on the front. He's on Facebook, mixing it up with foresters all the time.
Yeah.
In between his patrols. So people aren't dropping this ball. No, by any stretch of the imagination. But sometimes people are lost from the debate because of this horrible war. Yeah.
It's such a hard one to wrap your head around, right? Like the fact that people have the resilience to go out there during this crisis and be able to think about these less immediate concerns and be able to think about, okay, how do we recover this? How do we bounce back from this while it's still going on is just so admirable. And it's something to be proud of for sure. So I want to know, do you have any final thoughts about this whole situation going into it? Any frustrations, any final ideas that you want to share regarding this whole, I mean, you've provided a lot of information and a lot for people to think about, but is there anything you want to leave people with?
I would say, if we got any academics in the audience, we got any, maybe folks from, big land management agencies in North America, Ukraine's going to need a lot of help in a lot of ways.
Okay.
And definitely scientific and management assistance in this is needed for a Ukraine-driven process, driven by those kind of professionals and stakeholders I was just talking about who are still, on board. But it is unfathomable how much damage has been done to the country of Ukraine. I mean, we're talking about natural landscapes. The city that I was living in is smashed, maybe beyond possible recovery. An hour away was the city of Bakhmut, which is in the news right now. It looks like Hiroshima.
Ugh.
It's mind-boggling. And there's just so many different things that a country that was, struggling to get everything on track the way it wanted to anyway, and was dealing with a smaller war that was sort of dragging on, there's just so many ways they're going to need support. And so, if there are folks out there with research resources, with experience, I know one very experienced person from forestry community was going off to learn how to demine. He's inspired by the scale of this challenge and, helping Ukrainian land managers of all kinds get back into their landscapes. There's a lot of ways you can contribute. Ukraine's going to need resources.
Right.
So, I'd throw that out there in case there are any people in universities or agencies that might have something they could share with Ukraine. But, as I said, the challenge, I'm an outsider, but I've spent a lot of time there. I'm sort of, kind of on the line outsider and local. I would never call myself a Ukrainian, but, I was a resident.
Right.
Lived there and intended to live there, and I hope to be back living there for a lot of my life. We can contribute, but we got to keep our egos out of the way a little bit and let Ukrainians lead. But man, they're going to need a lot of support.
Well, it's clear. It's very, very clear that you're passionate about it, that you care about it deeply, and that your heart and your head are in the right place when you're thinking about this issue and trying to provide the support, whatever support you can. Do you know of any, resources, like for people that want to contribute in one way or another? How would they go about finding a way to, who to contact, how to reach out?
Yeah. Well, I mean, if they just want to contribute to help Ukrainian foresters who might be out doing firefighting, this season in UXO contaminated landscapes, which is going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, I do run a sort of perpetual fundraiser. Initially it was to evacuate civilians. Then it's been buying a lot of non-lethal weaponry stuff for Ukrainian soldiers, just things they need to live in the front lines.
Gotcha.
But now we are contributing to foresters.
Okay.
Who basically have, nothing but the state budget to back them up with safety equipment. So, I'd throw that out there.
Yeah. What's that? What's that website or whatever we can contribute?
Well, I have a GoFundMe.
Okay, perfect.
It's do I have it open here? Yep, I do. It's called sorry.
It's okay.
Evacuating Civilians from Eastern Ukraine.
Okay.
If you Google that on GoFundMe, you'll find it. It's run by a couple other people on because it was hard for me to set up GoFundMe from Ukraine. But it's that's one place. Okay. I'm also on Facebook.
Okay.
Brian Milakovsky, and it's pinned there as my first post.
Perfect.
So that's one thing. If you're, say, an academic and you'd like to support these efforts, my close colleague, Sergei Ziptsev, works at the Ukrainian Life Science and Bioresources University in Kyiv. I'd say they're really a center. He runs the Regional East European Fire Management Center. It's not like he's got a place you can, donate or something, but he's very open. He's globally connected, working right now with for instance, GIS scientists around the world. We're quantifying. He's quantifying. I'm a limited contributor to war damages to forests using GIS. I would say that university is a fantastic place that researchers could work with, but there isn't sort of a centralized way to support, I'd say, Ukrainian foresters, forest science, and forests. And I think it needs to come into being.
Mm-hmm. Is to support the Ukrainian war effort in general, is like the Red Cross a good one to go with, or is there like do you know of a specific one?
As someone who worked in global humanitarian response in Ukraine, those are wonderful organizations. They get big funding sources from governments. I would contribute to Ukrainian grassroots. Yeah. Of which there are just so many. That's actually where most of the money I collect goes, is to volunteer groups in Eastern Ukraine. I mean, gosh, there's just so many of them.
Maybe you could send me an email with some of the links.
Yeah, I'll send you an email with some links.
Notes.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
let me do it that way.
Yeah.
There's a bunch of really great organizations. Okay. Not because the big ones are doing anything wrong,
right,
but they've got their own funding sources. It's the Ukrainian volunteers that really need those kinds of donations.
Yeah, straight to the source, for sure. Well, that makes sense. Awesome. Well, Brian, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your workcation. You're in Croatia right now, right?
Yes, I am. Yeah.
Yes. And living in Latvia, though, right?
Yes.
Yes. And so I appreciate you taking the time out of your workcation from the family to break down this situation in Ukraine for us. There's so much to think about here. And I know when I first listened to you give that presentation, I was taken aback by how much there was and the things I never would have even thought about, right? That seem obvious now in retrospect, right? But it's quite the cause. And I think, I hope listeners reach out and try to support this in any way they can, because they need as much help as they can get. So I appreciate you taking the time. Thank you once again. And,
thank you.
Yeah, this is just a fascinating conversation. And, good luck to everyone in Ukraine. Thank you so much for listening. My heart goes out to everybody in Ukraine trying to deal with this unbelievable situation. I couldn't imagine how difficult this must be, and all the challenges, and everything's building up, and clearly a resilient people. And I really encourage everybody to go to those links to donate, to help. If you can go there and help in whatever way you can. I know there's firefighters going over. I know there's always people going over to help, and it's just so admirable, and they need what they can get. So please do that. Reach out to Brian. He can lead you in the right direction on some of this stuff. And good luck out there. We'll catch you next time.